Did you know that a Quran teacher in Libya once fought a war against one of the most powerful empires in Europe? You see, in the early 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was in political chaos, with Islamic and secular forces vying for the throne. And in 1909, the last great sultan was overthrown by secular forces within the empire and forced into exile. At the time, the Ottoman Empire still maintained various territories in Greece, the Middle East, and North Africa. But seeing the Ottomans now in a state of weakness, some of the European powers began to make plans for these territories. In 1911, the Kingdom of Italy declared war against the Ottoman Empire, invading Libya just across the Mediterranean Sea, looking to compete with the other European nations by building their own empire. The war began with Italy landing on the shores and capturing the city of Tripoli. Soon after, they began attacking other major coastal cities, including Tobruk, Derna, Benghazi, and Al-Homs, killing many Ottoman soldiers and pushing them out. Italy then began putting pressure on the Ottomans in lands much closer to home. They invaded and captured the Dodecanese Islands just off the coast of Turkey and began bombing the city of Beirut, as well as the Dardanelles, the naval gateway that leads to Istanbul. Weak and unable to sustain the war, the Ottomans quickly accepted a peace agreement, and after just over 1 year of fighting, they were forced to retreat, leaving the Italians in control. But while the Italians may have defeated the Ottoman Empire in Libya, they would soon find out the real battle had only just begun. And little did they know, they were at the beginning of a very painful war that would last them another 20 years. You see, while the Ottoman Empire had been the main governing force in Libya for quite some time, another group of militant warriors had soon been on the rise. In 1837, a man named Muhammad ibn Ali as-Sanusi began preaching Islam in Libya with the goal of reviving Islam during a time when Western influence had begun to permeate the society. He began building zawiyas throughout the deserts of North Africa, which were religious schools that served as community centers and places of learning. Soon, these schools began to attract students from throughout the region, and even though Muhammad as-Sanusi passed away in 1860, these schools continued to grow and expand, and thus the Sanusi order was born. Before long, the order had become politically influential in the neighboring lands, and with the European powers invading the Muslim world, they began to organize themselves into military units and take up arms. During the Italo-Turkish War, the Sanusi order had supported the Ottomans and fought a war of guerrilla tactics against the invading Italians. And now, with the Ottomans gone, there was no one else to lead the resistance, and so the Sanusi order took their place. At the head of the Sanusi army was the famous Omar Al-Mukhtar, a Quran teacher in his 50s who had the heart of a lion. He began leading small groups of Muslim warriors out into the desert, attacking the Italians from all sides in hit-and-run tactics. The Italians, not used to fighting in the desert, had no way of answering these attacks. Omar and his troops attacked outposts and set up ambushes. They cut lines of communication and prevented supplies from reaching Italian troops. The Italians still held the coastline of Libya, but they had no way of pushing into the interior of the country. And now the Sanusi order was pushing closer and closer, and it was no longer clear if the Italians could even hold that. It was now 1917, and World War I had been going on for 3 years now. The Italians, weakened by the war and unable to push back against the Libyan resistance, made a peace agreement with Omar, and even though they still held on to a few coastal cities, they formally recognized the Sanusi control over most of Libya. It was a monumental victory for the rebels. This small group of Islamic students who lived in the desert, led by an old man in his 50s, managed to force one of the great European powers into a peace agreement. And while that agreement lasted another 5 years, it was short-lived, as in 1922, a new prime minister would rise to power who would ally himself with Nazi Germany and transform Italy into a fascist state. His name was Benito Mussolini, and he was determined to conquer Libya once and for all. And by the way, if you want to support the channel and help me pay my editors, you can sign up for my Patreon, link in the YouTube video description or on my TikTok profile. Anyway, Mussolini began a campaign of immense pressure in Libya. He began by cutting Libya down the middle, splitting the east from the west by using aircraft and motor vehicles. The Sanusi rebels, who were mainly on horseback, were mostly confined to the eastern half of Libya and were unable to help the rebel allies in the west against the Italian invasion. Soon, the Italians began expanding their territories along both the eastern and western coasts of Libya, relying heavily on bombing targets from the sky and rounding up civilians in the territories they captured and forcing them into concentration camps. Desperately, Omar and his men continued their tactics of guerrilla warfare, slowing down the Italian army in the east of the country. Soon began a game of cat and mouse where the Italians began laying ambushes against the Sanusi order, and then Omar would find out about these ambushes and set up their own. But the Sanusi order knew that the Italians were closing in and that their days were numbered. Some 33,000 Italian troops were fighting a war against only around 6,000 Libyan fighters, and they were bombing them from the sky. The Italians took town after town and village after village. The Libyan people were being killed and tortured and starved to death. And by 1931, well over half of the population in eastern Libya were confined to 15 concentration camps, and Italian airplanes were dropping chemical weapons on the fighters who resisted. The Italians were closing in. The situation was desperate. All hope was lost. And on September 11, 1931, wounded in the battle near the town of Slonta, Omar Al-Mukhtar was finally captured, and with that, the resistance crumbled. By now, Italy was in control over nearly the entire country, with very little resistance left in its way. And a few days later, Omar was brought to the gallows. His head was placed in a noose, and at the old age of 73, after nearly 20 years of fighting, the trapdoor beneath his feet was swung open, and Omar Al-Mukhtar was left hanging until his death. May Allah forgive him and count him among the shuhada. Like if all for more, Muslim Facts.